The dark side of spoiled youth, a college girl's heartless joke. The room felt smaller now. The walls closed in on her. A flicker of dread crawled up her spine. The faint smell of antiseptic mixed with the sharpness of fear. Her breath was shallow, quick. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She never imagined the weight of it. The stillness. The silence. Everything around her felt too quiet. Too heavy. Her fingers trembled as they touched the edge of the crib. The baby wasn't crying anymore. That too was wrong. Everything was wrong. She leaned closer, but couldn't bring herself to look. Her stomach twisted. A sharp, biting sensation that made her feel sick. Her throat tightened, a knot that wouldn't loosen. It wasn't supposed to be real. The faintest noise. A soft scraping sound from the corner. Her head snapped toward it. The door was ajar. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed down the hall. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. Tighter. Tighter. A chill crept up her neck. Someone was coming. She knew it. They would find her. She should leave. She should run. But her feet were frozen to the floor. She couldn't move. The baby lay still. So still. A sudden rush of nausea hit her. The baby's tiny body was cold. Too cold. Her hands shook harder now. A soft whimper escaped her lips. Her mind screamed at her to move, to flee. But there was no escaping. Not from this. Not from the truth. Her stomach turned. The footsteps grew louder. Closer. She could hear her own breath, shallow, frantic. Her vision blurred. Tears welled up, but she didn't dare blink. She couldn't look away. The door creaked open wider. A shadow filled the frame. The air felt suffocating. A voice, quiet, trembling, whispered from the doorway. "You did this." Her heart stopped. And the world tilted. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. "You did this." Her body froze. Her mind raced. She tried to speak, but her mouth was dry. Nothing came out. The figure in the doorway stepped forward. Slow. Methodical. Her eyes darted between the crib and the shadow. Her chest tightened with panic. The figure's features were still hidden in the dark. Only the faint outline of a face. A face she recognized. A face she wished she could forget. The room grew colder. The shadow loomed larger. Then, the voice again. "How could you?" It was barely a whisper, but it cut through her. She couldn't breathe. The weight of the silence threatened to crush her. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Her legs, weak, gave way. She sank to the floor, unable to stop herself. The figure didn't move. Didn't say anything more. Just stood there. Watching. Waiting. Her heart pounded in her chest. She could hear it in her ears, a relentless thumping. The air felt thick, suffocating. The world outside this room didn't matter anymore. There was only the room. Only the presence. The baby, still in the crib, still too quiet. Too still. She reached out, her hand trembling, as if to touch it. To make sure it was real. To feel something. But she couldn't. The voice spoke again, softer this time. "You'll never escape this." Her body jerked as if struck. Her eyes darted up, desperate. "Why?" she finally croaked. The shadow didn't answer. It didn't need to. The answer was already written. In the stillness. In the cold. In the dark. And it would stay there forever. Her heartbeat slowed. She looked down at her hands. There was no turning back. There never was. Not now. Not ever. The door slammed shut. And the darkness swallowed her whole. The darkness pressed in around her, suffocating. Her chest felt tight, like her very breath was being stolen. Her hands, cold and trembling, clutched the floor beneath her. The room seemed to stretch, the walls pulling farther away, then collapsing inward. Time no longer existed. The air tasted metallic, sharp, bitter. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she could hear whispers. Not from the figure in the doorway. No. These whispers came from all around her. From everywhere. Just empty black voids. The room grew colder still. Her body trembled. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a scream that wanted to tear out of her throat. But no sound came. The baby's eyes stared straight at her. And then, they blinked. Once. Slowly. A single tear fell from one empty eye. And in that moment, she knew. She would never escape this. Never. The door slammed open again. And the figure stepped into the room. The silence was deafening. But the figure wasn't looking at her anymore. No. It was looking at the crib. The baby. The darkness. And that was all. Nothing more. Nothing else. The figure stood motionless, as if frozen in time. Its gaze never left the crib. The air thickened around her, suffocating. She could feel the weight of its stare, pressing into her skin. A chill ran through her veins. Her hands shook violently now, clutching the floor, but it did nothing to stop the tremors. The baby's empty eyes were still locked on her. The darkness behind it seemed to deepen, swallowing everything else. The figure moved, just slightly. A step forward. And then, another. The baby's body twisted further, as though reaching out, towards the figure. The coldness intensified. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. She couldn't take it. Her body screamed to run. To flee this place, this nightmare. But she couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away. The figure stopped at the edge of the crib, its silhouette now fully in view. The face was hidden in shadow. But she could feel it. The eyes, those cold, unfeeling eyes. They were looking at her. Watching. Waiting. The room began to spin. Faster. Faster. Her heart raced, each beat growing louder in her ears. From inside her. 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. Accusations. Condemnations. Questions. Demands. She shut her eyes tight. But it didn't help. It only made everything feel worse. Her breath came in jagged gasps, and she could feel her pulse hammering in her temples. The stillness was unbearable. The baby in the crib, she had to look at it again. Had to see it. But something inside her screamed not to. Something deep within her begged her to leave. Run. But her body refused. Her feet, frozen to the floor. Her body, bound by the invisible weight of her own choices. She forced her eyes open. The crib was empty. For a moment, her heart stopped. Had she imagined it? Had she? No. The baby was still there. But now, it wasn't just still. It was wrong. The tiny body was contorted, twisted at unnatural angles. Its limbs unnaturally bent, as though it had been placed there, broken. It felt wrong. Her stomach churned. Her throat burned with the bile rising. No. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Her hands, still shaking, reached out once more. But she stopped. Something was there. Something new. A shadow, moving just behind the crib. Slow. Heavy. Her breath caught. And then it happened. The baby's eyes opened. Wide. Unblinking. But there was nothing in them. No innocence. No life. The figure raised its hand slowly. She wanted to scream. Wanted to beg. But no sound came. The hand hovered above the crib, trembling. The darkness seemed to ripple beneath it. The baby's form shifted again, its limbs twitching, jerking in strange, unnatural movements. And then, the figure spoke. A voice like broken glass. "Now you see." Her chest tightened. Her throat felt like it was closing in on her. Her body was screaming to move, to escape, but her mind was locked in place. She knew. She knew what was coming. And there was no way out. The figure reached down. Its fingers brushed against the baby's cold skin. For the first time, the baby moved. A sharp, unnatural crack echoed through the room. Her vision blurred again. The world around her seemed to collapse in on itself. The figure turned its head slowly. Its eyes, now fully visible, were empty. Black. Endless. Staring straight into her soul. "You did this," the figure whispered. The darkness surged, swallowing everything whole. And she knew. There was no escape. No redemption. Just the endless black void. The void was all-encompassing, suffocating. She couldn't feel her body anymore. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Only darkness. The silence pressed against her ears, heavy, deafening. And then, something. A low, rasping sound, like a breath drawn from the depths of the earth. She tried to scream, but her voice had long abandoned her. Her limbs felt numb. Her mind felt distant, fractured. The baby's twisted form was no longer in the crib. It was everywhere now. In the shadows. In the corners of her vision. In the very air. Her eyes darted frantically, but there was nothing to see. Only that suffocating blackness. And that low, constant sound, the breathing. Close. Too close. It was all around her now. The figure had vanished, but its presence lingered in the air, thick, suffocating. She could feel it in the weight of the silence. In the cold creeping along her skin. The baby's eyes, those voids, stared back at her from every angle, every shadow. It wasn't just a presence now. It was her. She was part of it. A part of the darkness. The low breathing grew louder. Closer. She turned, but there was no escape. No exit. Nothing but the endless, choking darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest, the beat erratic, out of control. And then it stopped. Just like that. Her breath, her pulse, everything stopped. She was frozen. Frozen in place. Frozen in time. And the whispers came again. Soft at first. Barely audible. Then louder. Closer. They were her own thoughts, her own voice, but twisted, warped. "You did this. You couldn't stop. You never cared." And then, an overwhelming sensation, something like a weight pressing on her chest. It was crushing. Her lungs burned. But she couldn't scream. Couldn't breathe. Her chest felt like it was caving in. Her fingers twitched, just barely. But they couldn't reach out. There was nothing to touch. Nothing to hold on to. The breathing was so close now. A sharp rasp. A final, agonizing breath. And then, silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. The void swallowed her whole. And she was gone. Forever. In the silence, there was nothing. No sound, no light, no feeling. Just the endless, suffocating black. But then, something shifted. A whisper. Barely a breath. Faint. Barely noticeable. Yet unmistakable. "You're still here." It wasn't her voice. Not anymore. The words vibrated in her mind. They echoed, bouncing off the walls of her thoughts. Her body remained frozen, a shell of what it once was. She wanted to move. To scream. To escape. But she couldn't. Her thoughts were trapped in the dark, clawing, desperate. "Why are you still here?" the voice whispered again. The words cut through the stillness like a knife. And then, she felt it. A sensation, slight, almost imperceptible. A pressure against her chest. A weight. Cold. Heavy. A breath. A pulse. And then, more whispers. They didn't come from outside. They were inside her. Rising from the pit of her mind. Her own voice. But it wasn't her anymore. I didn't mean to, she thought, but the words felt foreign. They didn't sound like her. They didn't sound like anything she knew. You never meant to, the voice answered. But you did. Her heart fluttered, a weak, desperate beat, then stopped again. And with that, the suffocating darkness receded just enough to reveal the crib. The baby. Empty, silent. The twisted figure standing beside it, looking down at her. But now, it was her reflection. Her face staring back at her from the shadows. She tried to scream, but her mouth didn't open. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't scream. The baby's body twisted again. Not the way it had before. No. Now, it was growing. Reaching. Towards her. The darkness seemed to split open, revealing more of the room. More of her own reflection. The walls closed in, suffocating her again. But now, they weren't just walls. They were mirrors. Endless mirrors. Reflecting her. Each one more distorted than the last. Her hands reached out in the mirrors. But they were empty. Her reflection was not hers anymore. It was something else. And the whispers came again. You did this. You can't undo it. You'll never escape. And in that moment, she realized. She was still here. But she would never leave. The mirrors stretched out before her, endless and unyielding. Each one reflected a version of her, warped and twisted. Her face was no longer her own. It was blank. Hollow. A shell. The whispers grew louder. Closer. She couldn't escape them. Couldn't escape herself. The figures in the mirrors moved independently of her. Each one smirked. Each one mocked her. Their eyes hollow, black voids staring right through her. Her chest tightened with panic. Her breath came in jagged, painful bursts. But still, no scream. No escape. The mirrors multiplied. Filling every inch of space. Every reflection and accusation. You knew. You always knew. The voice was hers, but it wasn't. It came from everywhere, inside her, outside her. She tried to move, to flee, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was trapped. Trapped in a world of her own making. Each reflection of herself twisted in grotesque, unnatural ways. Her hands contorted, her mouth stretched into a smile she didn't recognize. The walls of mirrors closed in tighter, pressing against her. She reached out, touching the cold glass. Her fingers left streaks of black, as if the mirror itself were bleeding. Her reflection didn't flinch. It just stared back at her. Unblinking. Unyielding. She couldn't look away. I'm not real, she whispered, barely audible. But the words felt wrong. Hollow. Neither are we, a voice replied, her own voice, but cold and lifeless. Her body shook violently. The mirrors flickered, showing flashes of things she didn't want to see. Images. Familiar, twisted images. The baby. The twisted figure. And then, her own hands. Covered in blood. Her reflection grinned. A wide, sharp-toothed grin. And she felt something stir inside her. A cold, terrible recognition. The figure in the shadows, the one that haunted the room, it was her. All along, it had been her. The thing she couldn't escape. The thing she had become. The mirrors began to crack. 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 Shattered pieces falling to the floor in slow motion. And then, everything stopped. Dead silence. She was alone. But the fragments of glass were still there. still reflecting the twisted, fractured version of herself. The floor beneath her felt wrong. The shadows closed in. She couldn't see the walls anymore. She couldn't see anything. Except herself. Always herself. The whispers were gone, but their presence lingered. And the darkness around her swirled, swallowing her whole. There was no way out. Not now. Not ever. And the last thing she heard was her own laughter. The blackness was suffocating, all-consuming. It wasn't quiet anymore. The whispers were back, louder now, filling the space around her. But this time, they weren't just in her head. They were everywhere. The shadows twisted and writhed like living things, crawling along the edges of her vision. She wanted to move, to get away, but her body was trapped, frozen in place. The darkness had its hold on her now. There was no escape. No way out. Her mind was slipping, fragments of her thoughts scattering like pieces of glass. "You're still here," the voice whispered, but this time it sounded different. It wasn't the cold, detached voice from before. This voice was familiar. It was her own. But distorted. Twisted. It was her, yet it wasn't. Her chest tightened. She gasped, trying to pull in air, but the blackness smothered her. It was suffocating. Her limbs felt heavy. Her fingers tingled as though they were waking up from a long, painful sleep. She tried to speak, but the words were trapped in her throat. The whispers didn't stop. "You can't undo it," they taunted. "You're part of it now." Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, deafening. The air felt thick, like a storm was building. A sense of pressure, of something about to break. And then, just when she thought she might suffocate entirely, a sharp crack split the silence. The blackness shattered. A light. But it wasn't real light. It was cold, harsh, artificial, like the flickering of a dying bulb. She blinked, and in the instant the light came, she saw something. A figure standing before her. Tall. Dark. It was the same figure. The one that had haunted her. The one she had tried to escape. It was now standing directly in front of her, its face hidden in shadow, but she knew it was watching her. "You're still here," it said, its voice echoing in the broken space around them. "You can't leave. Not anymore." The words sank into her chest like stones. Her limbs trembled with the effort to move. But still, she couldn't. Her reflection appeared in the shattered pieces of light, broken, distorted, like the cracks in her mind. Her face was twisted. She reached out, touching the fragments, but they didn't feel like glass. They felt alive. They rippled, pulsed, and vibrated beneath her fingers. The figure stepped closer, its shadow stretching across the broken shards, enveloping her. "You're mine now," it whispered, voice like silk. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. And she knew. There was no escape. She had never been free. And the blackness closed in again, but now, it wasn't just suffocating. It was consuming. The last thing she felt was her own breath, slow, shallow, and then, nothing. Only the endless void. The void swallowed her whole, a vast emptiness that stretched beyond comprehension. Time didn't exist here. There was no weight, no sound, no sensation. Only darkness. She couldn't feel her body anymore, as if it had dissolved into the blackness itself. No, she wasn't gone. Not entirely. She was trapped. Trapped in a place that wasn't a place. A space without edges. Without boundaries. Just nothing. And yet, the whispers persisted. Soft at first, like a distant murmur, but they grew louder. Closer. "You're still here," the voice echoed. It wasn't just a voice, it was part of her. A part she couldn't escape. "You can't escape." Her mind screamed, but no sound came. Her thoughts collided against the blackness, rebounding with nothingness. She tried to move, but she couldn't. She was stuck. stuck in the very place she'd created. Her heart beat weakly, like the fading pulse of something that was already gone. You thought you could outrun it, the voice whispered, but it was no longer just one voice. It was many voices. Her voice. The baby's voice. The figure's voice. All layered over one another. All accusing. You thought you could forget. You thought you could escape the truth. Her body felt cold, but the cold wasn't physical. It was inside her. A cold that settled deep within her bones, into her very soul. You did this. The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The emptiness surrounded her, and she couldn't breathe. There was no air. No oxygen. No life. And then, in the distance, a flicker. A tiny light, almost imperceptible at first. But it grew. A harsh, bright light. It pierced the void, searing her eyes. It was painful. Too painful. But still, it pulled at her, drawing her towards it. She didn't know why she moved. It was like an instinct, something deep within her that refused to die, no matter how much she wanted to let go. She moved toward the light, though every step felt like an eternity. It wasn't freedom. It wasn't release. It was punishment. As she neared, the light grew brighter, sharper, more blinding. And the voices grew louder, overwhelming her. You can't escape it, they screamed. You belong to it now. She reached out for the light, but as her fingers touched it, everything shattered. The light exploded in a blinding flash, consuming everything. The last thing she felt was the sensation of falling. 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 Into nothing. And then, silence. Complete and utter silence. Forever. The silence was absolute. No whispers. No echoes. Nothing. Not even the sound of her own breath. It was as if everything, her, the void, the darkness, the light, had been erased. She wasn't sure how much time passed. It could have been seconds, or an eternity. There was no way to tell. Her senses had dulled completely. But then, a soft pressure against her skin, something warm. A subtle weight. Her fingers twitched, unbidden. A faint sensation. The weight was familiar, though she couldn't place it. Slowly, painfully, she tried to move. Her limbs felt stiff, like they hadn't been used in years. But the pressure, it was still there. It was like the world had come back, but in fragments. A half memory, a half sensation, floating somewhere between reality and dream. Her eyes blinked open, if they were even her eyes anymore. She wasn't sure. Everything around her was blurry, as if she were seeing through a fog. A sound came, far away, like a hum or a buzz, echoing faintly in the distance. She couldn't make sense of it, but it felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. Her body ached. Her chest tightened, and her throat burned as though she had been screaming for hours. She tried to speak. But no sound came. Only the hum. The pressure on her skin was there again, more insistent now. It felt like fingers. Fingers that had once been her own. Reaching out. Grasping. Pulling her forward. She gasped, but her breath was shallow. Barely there. She opened her mouth to scream, but the words never formed. The buzzing sound grew louder. It wasn't just a hum anymore. It was a chorus. 1,000 whispers, all merging into one cacophony of voices. You're still here, they chanted. You will never leave. The words repeated, echoing inside her skull. And then, there was light again. Not the blinding light from before, but something different. Flickering. Pulsing. It grew brighter and brighter, until it engulfed everything. But this time, it didn't hurt. This time, it felt like a rebirth. A cruel rebirth. The pressure on her skin shifted, as if the fingers were now pressing harder. Faster. Fingers of shadows. Of broken things. Her body jerked forward, and suddenly, the light cracked open. It split into pieces, as though it were shattering. And through the cracks, she saw the truth. It wasn't the light she had sought. It was a reflection. A reflection of everything she had become. The truth was staring back at her. The baby. The figure. The mirrors. Her reflection, twisted, contorted, her face smiling back at her in cruel mockery. The light faded, leaving only the whispering shadows. "You did this," the voices whispered. "You can't escape. You never will." And as the darkness enveloped her again, she understood. This wasn't a prison. This was her forever. Her eternal, unending fate. The light was gone. The whispers stopped. And she was left alone in the void. Forever. The void stretched on, infinite and silent. Her mind, once filled with the chaos of whispers and distortions, now felt like a hollow shell. Empty. There was no sensation, no warmth, no cold, no sound. Nothing. She couldn't remember if she was still breathing, if her heart was still beating. She couldn't remember if she had ever been alive. The darkness around her grew heavier, pressing in on her from every direction, folding in like a dark, suffocating blanket. Her thoughts felt fragmented, pieces of memories slipping through her fingers, like sand falling through a cracked jar. She tried to think, tried to recall who she had been before this. But the more she searched, the more distant it became. Her name. Her face. Her life. It all seemed irrelevant now. Like a story told long ago, forgotten and erased. There was no past. No future. Only the endless present. And then, as if to fill the emptiness, the whispers returned. Soft at first, like a faint breeze. "You thought you could escape," they murmured. But this time, the voices weren't just outside her. They were inside her. Filling her mind, her very being. "You never could." Her body trembled, though she no longer had the energy to move. The whispers spiraled, growing louder. "You belong to it now," they said, over and over. "You are the darkness." The words wrapped themselves around her mind, sinking deeper, taking root. She wanted to scream. To run. To fight. But there was no more fight left in her. No more resistance. She was the darkness now. And the darkness was her. Her form began to fade into it. Her edges blurred, her body and the blackness becoming one. She was swallowed by it, consumed completely. And in the end, there was nothing left. Just the whispering. Endless, eternal, suffocating whispers. And the darkness. Forever. There was no more light. No more sound. Only the infinite expanse of emptiness. Her sense of self had dissolved. Her thoughts were fragmented, scattered, lost in the void. She tried to grasp them, to hold on to something, anything. But each attempt was like trying to catch smoke. Her memories were no longer hers. Her identity was slipping, fading, unraveling. And yet, there was a feeling, one she couldn't escape. A weight. A suffocating pressure that filled every part of her being. It wasn't physical, but it was there, heavy and relentless. It was the feeling of being watched. Of being trapped in the very space she had created. The darkness wasn't empty. It was full of eyes. Full of presence. Invisible, but undeniable. She could feel them now. The eyes. They were all around her. Staring. Watching. Waiting. "You can't escape," the voices whispered, so close now they felt like they were inside her skull. "You can never escape." Her breath came in shallow gasps, but they didn't feel like her breaths anymore. They were mechanical, robotic, forced. Her chest was hollow, a vacuum where her heart should have been. But still, the voices pressed in. Still, they echoed through her, relentless. "You've always been here." Her mind flashed with images, fragments of what she used to be, what she used to feel. But they didn't make sense anymore. The baby. The figure. The mirrors. The glass. Her reflection. Her twisted face. Each image flickered in and out of existence, never fully solid, always shifting. You were never free, the voices said. You just didn't know it yet. The darkness thickened, suffocating her, closing in around her like a noose. Her body, or what was left of it, felt numb, disconnected. She couldn't feel her limbs. She couldn't feel her face. Only the weight of those unseen eyes. Only the whispers that never stopped. She wanted to scream. But there was no sound. She wanted to cry. But there were no tears. The void had swallowed everything. And she realized, finally, she had never been anything but part of it. Part of the dark. Part of the endless, empty void that had always been waiting. Her fate was sealed. Not just in this moment, but in every moment that led her here. She was the darkness now. And the darkness was her. Forever. No escape. No end. Just the endless, suffocating weight of it. The weight of it pressed deeper, suffocating every fragment of thought. She didn't know how long she had been lost in the void. Time had no meaning here. Her existence had become nothing more than an endless loop of silence and darkness. A cycle with no beginning, no end. The whispers, always there, began to shift. They weren't just echoes anymore. They were memories. Fragments of her own voice. You thought you could escape, she heard, but this time, it wasn't the cold, mocking tone she had come to expect. It was different. It was her own voice. Barely a whisper. And then, it grew stronger. More insistent. You did this. The words pressed into her, vibrating through her, reaching the deepest corners of her shattered mind. You can never undo it. She tried to speak, tried to respond, but there were no words. Only the faintest tremor in her chest. And then, the weight of the voices seemed to shift, moving toward her. Closer. Closer. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the darkness seemed to shift. It wasn't just a void anymore. There was something within it. Something moving. It wasn't visible, not in any way she could comprehend, but she could feel it. It was drawing closer, just beyond the edges of her perception. A presence. A force. The whispers were becoming more frantic now. They clawed at her mind, pulling at her, desperate. You never should have laughed, the voice, her voice, said. It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was a reminder. A command. You thought you could outrun it, the voice continued, but now it was layered with something LSE. Something darker. But you can't. You never could. The presence was almost upon her now. It was suffocating. Her heart thudded wildly in her chest, a frantic, primal reaction, but it didn't feel like her heart. It felt like something foreign, something alive. Something that had been with her all along. The darkness swirled, deeper, colder. A voice that wasn't hers, but somehow was, whispered in her ear. You're still here. And then, the faintest crack appeared in the void. A single, jagged line of light, seeping through. It wasn't bright. It wasn't warm. But it was there. It was enough to break through the suffocating darkness, just for a moment. Her eyes, if they were still her eyes, tried to focus on it. She reached for it. Her fingers, shaking, extended into the light. But the moment her skin touched it, the darkness roared back, swallowing her hand in an instant. The line of light vanished. And the voices, the whispers. They laughed. The sound was so deafening it was like the very fabric of her mind was tearing apart. You thought it was a way out, they jeered. You were never meant to escape. And she knew, without a single doubt, that they were right. There was no way out. Not anymore. She was the darkness. And the darkness was her. Forever. Endlessly. An eternity of whispers. An eternity of nothingness. The laughter faded, but the suffocating presence of the darkness remained, wrapping tighter, colder. Her mind was numb. But still, something deep inside, fought against it. A small, flickering ember of resistance, buried deep beneath the weight of it all. Her thoughts felt distant, disconnected. But still, there was a thread, thin, fragile. A memory. The memory of light. The memory of a time before. Before the darkness. Before the whispers. She couldn't hold on to it for long. It slipped through her fingers like water, lost in the endless night. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow. There was a hunger inside her, a gnawing emptiness that had become a part of her very being. And the darkness fed on it. It pulsed around her, a living thing, constantly shifting, stretching, consuming. It felt like it was growing, becoming more real with each passing moment. The voices, once just whispers, were now clear. They were her thoughts. Her guilt. Her fear. You can't escape, they said. You never could. And then, there was something new. A shift. A change. It was subtle, like the air before a storm. But it was there. Something was watching. The darkness had eyes. Unblinking. Unforgiving. She felt them. Cold, empty eyes, all around her. Watching. Waiting. For what, she didn't know. But she could feel it. The pressure building again, the overwhelming weight of a presence so vast, so consuming, it threatened to crush her very soul. Her thoughts became frantic, spiraling, trying to find any way to escape, to break free. But there was nothing. Nothing but the darkness. And the whispers. You did this, they said. You can never undo it. Her own voice echoed in her mind, repeating the words. Over and over. You can never undo it. And then, for a brief moment, she thought she saw something. A flash of light. Not bright, not warm. But there. A flicker. It came and went so quickly she wasn't sure if she imagined it. But the darkness seemed to recoil from it. Like it was afraid. For just a heartbeat, she felt the faintest sense of relief. A moment where she almost believed she could escape. She reached out again. But the moment her fingers brushed the air, the darkness surged back, enveloping her once more. The light vanished. And the whispers returned. Closer now. Deeper. You can't leave. You belong to us. The voices weren't just outside her anymore. They were inside. They were her thoughts. Her own guilt, her own fear, turned into a chorus. And in that moment, she knew. There was no escape. The light wasn't meant for her. She wasn't meant for the light. She was meant for this. The darkness. And the darkness would never let her go. Forever. Endlessly. And with that realization, she surrendered. Her thoughts faded. Her sense of self dissolved. And the last shred of resistance crumbled into the infinite void. The silence was all-consuming. And the darkness was complete. Forever. The void swallowed her completely. There was no resistance left. No fight. Just the infinite weight of emptiness. No sound, no light, no sensation. Only the suffocating silence pressing in from all sides. Her mind was a fractured echo of what it once was. A distant memory of a time before the endless blackness. Before the whispers. Before the laughter. It seemed so distant now. The presence that had haunted her, the eyes watching from the dark, were gone. Or perhaps, they were always there, just out of her reach. A vague, lingering presence. Unseen. Unfelt. But always there. Time no longer existed. She was lost in the timelessness of it. The sensation of being nothing. Of having been nothing all along. Her consciousness flickered, like a candle's dying flame in a void of nothingness. For a moment, just a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream. A terrible nightmare. But no. The whispers weren't gone. They were inside her now. Their presence had merged with hers, like roots intertwining, sinking deep into her thoughts. Her thoughts were their thoughts now. She couldn't tell where she ended and the whispers began. The guilt. The fear. The realization. It all swirled inside her, a perpetual storm of brokenness. You are nothing, the whispers murmured. You always were. The words stung, not like physical pain, but like an aching truth that cut through everything she had ever known. Her existence was a lie. A forgotten echo in the infinite darkness. There was no before. There was no after. Just the endless now. The void had no end. The darkness had no limit. And she was a part of it. The presence, once so distant, now was her. The void had claimed her. And in that final, horrible moment, she understood. The light she had glimpsed before wasn't salvation. It had been a lie. An illusion, meant to drag her further into the dark. And now, she had become one with it. She had always been part of it. Her laugh, her cruelty, her ignorance, it had all led her here. To this endless, suffocating, empty place. Forever. And as she sank deeper into it, her consciousness faded into the black. Until there was nothing left. Nothing but the void. And the whispers. The endless whispers that would never stop. That would never let her go. Forever. The silence fell again. Complete. And the darkness was all. The air was thick, stagnant, and suffocating. The absence of light was absolute. It felt like her body had dissolved into the dark, her form no longer distinct from the void that surrounded her. Nothing existed except the cold weight of it all, pressing in from all sides, suffocating, crushing. She tried to move, but her limbs were paralyzed, frozen in place as though something unseen was holding her down, binding her to the nothingness. Her thoughts were fragmented, shards of memories piercing the stillness, but they too slipped away before she could grasp them. Her name. Her past. The sound of her own voice. All of it, gone. The whispers had returned. Not outside of her, but within her. They swirled, tangled in her mind, a jumbled mess of accusations, mockery, and cold truths. You thought you could escape, they murmured, not a question, but a statement. A fact. You never could. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but her throat was dry, and no sound came. She could feel the whispers inside her, reverberating against the walls of her skull, growing louder and more insistent, until the pressure inside her head was unbearable. You were never meant to be free, the voices taunted. You're here because you belong here. And she knew they were right. She had always belonged to this place. The laughter, the cruelty, the selfishness, it had all led her here. A place where time didn't exist. A place where there was no light, no escape. Her past, her life, nothing mattered anymore. She was swallowed whole by the dark. She was nothing. And then, as if the darkness itself had heard her thoughts, there was a sudden shift. A faint crack in the void. A sliver of light. For just a moment, a flicker. But it wasn't a salvation. It was a reflection. Her face, twisted, broken, staring back at her from the light. Her reflection, distorted by the dark, grinning in silent mockery. And in that moment, she understood. The light wasn't meant to save her. The light was just another part of the darkness. She was part of it. Forever. And with that final truth, the darkness closed in once again. She was consumed. Completely. Endlessly. Forever. The darkness stretched out endlessly, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating cocoon. She could feel the weight of it, the pressure, crushing every part of her being. It was as though time itself had ceased to exist. Her body felt weightless, but it wasn't the freedom of flight. No, it was the hollow emptiness of being untethered, disconnected from anything real, anything tangible. Her mind spun in a fog, fragmented memories floating in and out of her consciousness, but they were slipping through her fingers like sand. Faces, places, the sound of her own voice, all dissolving into the abyss. The whispers, they were back. But this time, they weren't distant. They weren't echoes from far away. They were inside her. "You're still here," they whispered, but it wasn't mocking anymore. It wasn't cruel. It was something else, something darker, more intimate. "You can't leave," the voices hummed softly, wrapping themselves around her thoughts like a cold, dark vine, entwining themselves deeper into the very core of her being. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow. She could feel the weight of her own guilt, of all that she had done, of who she had been. It was suffocating, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. "You've always been here," the voices murmured again, soft and persistent. "You just didn't know it." Her heart pounded in her ears, but there was no escape. The darkness was everywhere, inside her, outside her, wrapping tighter and tighter until there was no more room to move, no more air to breathe. And then, for a brief moment, a flicker. A faint light appeared in the distance. It wasn't bright. It wasn't warm. But it was there. A reflection. Her reflection. Twisted. Broken. But still, undeniably hers. It didn't offer salvation. It was a reminder. She had never escaped. She had never been free. And in that final, cruel moment, she understood. She had never been meant to escape. The darkness was part of her. And she was part of it. The light faded, leaving only the silence, the stillness, the weight of it all. The void closed in, pulling her deeper. And then, nothing. Forever.